So quick intro to Canadian politics. Just three quick things that we want you to understand. First, just about the parliamentary structure, then we'll talk a bit about the snap election, how that's possible, and then we'll end with some of the oddities of Canadian politics, that a few differences that are probably important to take note of. So let's go parliamentary structure. So Canadian politics follows a parliamentary structure, so similar to the other Commonwealth countries in the world. 16 nations have the Queen as their head of state, including the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, the Bahamas, Belize, Jamaica, and several others. The Governor General represents the Queen, and then there are two branches. There's the legislative branch and the executive branch. The executive branch is made up of the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's cabinet. The legislative branch is made up of the senators, which are recommended by the Prime Minister, and the House of Commons, who include the members who are voted in by the public. So pretty simple structure, and may not be dissimilar to our American brothers. So snap elections. When talking about snap elections, it's important to understand these two terms, a majority government and a minority government. So a majority government is a ruling political party who has more than 50% of the total votes, and a minority government is a party who has the most votes, but those votes are actually less than 50% of the total votes. So in Canada, currently, we have a minority government where the Liberal Party got the most votes in the last election, but less than 50%. And you can imagine that with less than 50% of the voting power, it's difficult to pass any laws. And so you end up in a situation where you have a snap election, which is an election that's called before an expected time. And really the best way to think about a snap election is to say, if you were the Prime Minister and you were given a cabinet of people from different parties and you all expected to work together, maybe at some point you realize that you can't work together, and this combination of people who are selected by the voting population just won't work. And you go back to your people and you say, hey, rearrange this, give us another set of people. We basically need to go back to the drawing board with this. And that's what happens during a snap election. The Prime Minister says to the people, it's time to hit the reset button and let's think about the makeup of our government structure. And so that's what's happening this year. It actually happened twice between 2017 and 2019 in the United Kingdom. They had 2 elections and 3 prime ministers during that time. This was during the Brexit time. And the way I would say of looking at that is the British people desperately wanted to leave the European Union, and they were willing to go to the polls on 2 separate occasions in a 2-year period to find the right prime minister that would allow for them to accomplish that goal. And so now in the 4 years since they started that, which would be about the same time as a typical PM's term, they're well on their way to having accomplished that goal. So let's move on, oddities in Canadian politics. So the first one I think is important to take a look at is the race for the Prime Minister. So actually, the Prime Minister is not elected. It's actually appointed by the Governor General, and it's appointed based on his leadership and respect within his party. And so that I think is an important difference between parliamentary politics and American politics. In America, there's a race for the election, for the presidency, and in Canada, there is not. He is elected in the same way that every other representative is elected. And finally, the right to vote. And so it's important to talk about a right to vote versus a voting privilege. Any of our brothers in Florida would be familiar with this. I came through in Florida at Rosi chapter, St. Leo University, spring of 5. And even then, when I was there at the time, I know recently during the previous election, this was an issue of incarcerated persons being able to have the right to vote after they were finished with their incarceration. But in Canada, the the right to vote is such that the Supreme Court has decided that even incarcerated persons should be allowed to vote. In fact, the only way that you can be excluded from the voting process is if you commit voter fraud. And even in that circumstance of having committed voter fraud, you can only be excluded for a certain amount of time. And that's the only way that you not be allowed to vote.